friends, thanks for tuning in and joining the channel. Today I have two watches I'd like to compare. On the left here I have the Omega Seamaster coaxial diver 300 meter with the wave dial. This model was released in 2018 and was met with widespread sort of acclaim in the watch industry for being known as sort of the sub killer, just due to its value and its specifications. And it's a very sharp looking watch as well. On the right here I have the previous iteration of this model. It's also a coaxial, and this model came out in 2012. So the Seamaster has seen a lot of iterations through the years. It was first seen on the wrist of Pierce Brosnan in GoldenEye back in the 90s, I believe it was 1995. And that piece was a quartz piece, and it had the wave pattern that was on the dial, but the wave pattern was very different from the current generation, which is laser engraved. That model sort of had like the tighter waves, and it went through a couple other iterations. It saw the introduction of an automatic movement, and then later on there was actually a transitional Seamaster that still had the waves, but it was actually the first iteration of the coaxial movement in this watch. But I've read somewhere that that watch had some issues with the coaxial movement. It was sort of like the first implementation of that movement. So it took a little bit of time for Omega to kind of perfect it and bring it into the 2012 generation. So despite the fact that these two watches are, the same model, they're both the Seamaster Professional Diver 300 meter, and they're only 6 years apart, there's a lot of key differences. In my opinion, these two watches feel almost like vastly different watches. And we'll go through some of those differences, and I'll pretty much sum up my feelings about these two watches and also get into my personal preference for which one I prefer of these two. So let's start with the older one. Now this one is the blue dial variation. It's also available in a black execution. As you can see, this was the generation where they removed the wave pattern, and you get this nice ceramic lacquer dial, which is very clean looking. The Omega logo on this model is actually applied, which I think is a really nice touch. On the newer generation, it's actually printed on. I just think it gives it sort of an extra premium kind of look. It has a 120 click unidirectional rotating ceramic bezel. And the action on this one is adequate, but it's not as smooth as the newer gen, which I'll show you a little bit later on. And you can see the date window on this watch is actually at the 3 o'clock position, whereas on the new model, they bumped it down to the 6 o'clock. The background of the date window is actually in black, but it's not super noticeable. There's been complaints about it not matching with the blue dial. I haven't really noticed it. I think it blends in pretty well. And the bracelet is that iconic bond bracelet. And the case back of this watch I think looks really beautiful, and it has this really nice etched wave pattern in the back as well, and the Omega logo. You're not going to get any type of on-the-fly adjustment in this watch. On the new one you do, but that does come at a caveat, and I'll go through the reasons for that. However, you do get a nice milled out diver's extension. It's also a little bit lighter than the new generation, and for that reason it wears really comfortably on the wrist. I'll show you guys a wrist shot. As you can see, it wears really beautifully. I have a 6.5 inch wrist in diameter. There's no taper on the bracelet, just like with the new generation. It's 20 millimeters all the way from the top all the way down. But one thing to note is that on this generation of Seamaster, the bracelet links are a little bit more comfortable. They're just ever so slightly more rounded versus the new gen, which I think are quite a bit sharper. And then the bracelet clasp is also a little bit sharper on the new model as well. Now, powering this watch is the Omega Caliber 2500. This is essentially an ETA 2892 movement that's been fitted with a coaxial escapement. It beats at the quirky coaxial rate of 3.5 hertz, and it carries a power reserve of 48 hours. And this isn't any kind of special chronometer, but it does fall within the regular COSC chronometer specs of -4 to +6 seconds a day. Now, in terms of the measurements of this watch, it's 41 millimeters in diameter, not including the crown. The thickness is 13 millimeters. The lug-to-lug distance is 47.5 millimeters. Let's go ahead and take a look at the new one. So this is the 2018 Omega Seamaster Diver 300 meter. And as you can see, it's a beautiful execution from a design perspective. You can see those ceramic waves that are etched into the ceramic dial. You can see that the date window has been moved down to the 6 o'clock position. And then the text on the bezel is a lot brighter. There's more contrast. So now it's more of a white, whereas the previous bezel text was a little bit more muted and kind of a silver tone, which I actually kind of prefer as it's a little bit more understated. It makes this watch a little bit more versatile. So this is actually a fully in-house movement from Omega. This is their master chronometer, caliber 8800. It carries 55 hours of power reserve, and it's tested to Omega's METAS certification, which is their master chronometer certification, which is essentially a bit more of a stringent test than the standard COSC certification. And this watch is rated to 0 to +5 seconds a day. It's resistant to magnetic fields of up to 15,000 Gauss. Basically, it means that this watch can stand up to even like an MRI machine. It's very, very rugged, very tough. The bezel action has been improved on this model. It's a little bit more smooth. As you can see, it's a little bit easier to turn and grip, and there's a little bit less play in between positions as well. So this watch is a millimeter wider in diameter than the previous model. It's at 42 millimeters. The lug width remains the same at 20 millimeters with no taper all the way down to the clasp. The lug-to-lug distance on this one is going to be a little bit longer than the previous model at 50.1 millimeters. And then they bumped up the thickness to about 13.7 millimeters. And a lot of that has to do with the display case back. Now you can see the clasp here has been improved in its function. And a lot of that is due to the addition of this push sliding adjustment system for on-the-fly adjustment. And then on this model, there's also a diver's extension as well. What I don't like about the new clasp, if you can't see already, is just its sheer size, its bulk. It's a huge clasp, especially if you compare it to the previous gen. It's almost twice the size of the previous generation clasp, which is just insane. I'm not sure if it needed to be this big. I don't know if Omega could have done anything else to kind of shrink it down, or maybe if they removed the dive extension, they could have shrunk down the size of this clasp. But as it stands, it's way too bulky, and it's just not the most comfortable clasp to kind of be slinging around in your wrist all day long. The bracelet is a little bit more squared off versus the previous generations. It's kind of hard to see just on camera, but on the wrist, it makes a huge difference. The squared off profile on the new model just really kind of sharpened up the bracelet overall and just makes it not as comfortable to wear. As you can see, it looks a lot larger. It's significantly bigger than the previous model. Even though it's only 1 millimeter wider, it just feels a lot bulkier, and it just looks like a much more beefier watch. And part of that is due to the size of the clasp, the thickness of the case, the increase in the lug distance, and then that 1 millimeter really does kind of add to all of that. So once again, let me show you the previous generation on my wrist. You see that it just wears a lot smaller. It is a lot lighter. The clasp is smaller. The watch itself is thinner. The lug to lug is considerably smaller as well. And then it has that 41 millimeter diameter, which I think just looks really great. Based off of my personal experience with both of these models, I've definitely leaned more towards the older model, just due to its comfort and the fact that it's just a little bit more elegant looking, a little bit more versatile, and it's just a lot lighter. The clasp is smaller, the bracelet's more comfortable, it's thinner, it's just more wearable on a day-to-day basis. The loom is slightly better on the new one. There's actually a little bit more loom on the skeleton hands, And then the maxi indices are just filled with lume. So this one's a little bit easier to read in the dark. And then another thing you'll notice is that the helium escape valve is huge on the new model. It's kind of like a Reese's peanut butter cup. It's just a lot more noticeable. And then on the previous generation, it's just a lot more subtle. I think what Omega is trying to do here is they're trying to embrace the design of the helium escape valve, be loud and proud about it. But in my personal opinion, I think it looks better, a little bit more understated. But you do get a lot of tech with this one. You get a really advanced in-house movement, the increased power reserve of 55 hours, the increased functionality of the clasp. You get the on-the-fly adjustment, an easier to grip, easier to turn bezel. If you're looking purely from a functionality perspective, definitely go with the new one. But if you're looking to, maybe save a little bit of money, still get a very solid watch, a Seamaster nonetheless, this is a great choice. It doesn't have the in-house caliber, it doesn't have all that impressive tech, but you're still getting a very stunning piece. I grew up watching Pierce Brosnan as James Bond on the big screen, and these two watches definitely bring that sense of nostalgia. I would say the older one kind of does a little bit better job of it because just proportionally it's more similar to the very first Bond watch, whereas the new one is just a lot bulkier. It kind of feels just kind of like a very different watch, but aesthetically you can still see the design continuity through the years. This is a very impressive watch, don't get me wrong, but I do feel that it can definitely be further refined. It's a little heavy, and then the bracelet and clasp can certainly also be made a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more lighter. Perhaps if they even added in a taper, that would probably help the overall comfort and wearability of this watch as well. I think if Omega kind of does a best of both worlds between these two models for their next iteration of this watch, I think they'll be spot on. I would love to see them kind of bring the proportions kind of back down to the original sizing, make a more comfortable bracelet, a smaller clasp, maybe make the design a little bit more subdued and not as flashy or eye-catching or high contrast. These are all just my opinions, guys. I think the Seamaster is just a very solid watch. I've enjoyed my time wearing both of these watches. It's just the 2012 one just is a bit more charming, a bit more understated, a bit more versatile, and would be my personal pick between these two. So it really is kind of like a toss-up, but let me know what you guys think. Which one would you choose? Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed. I'll catch you in the next video. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't gotten the chance to, please subscribe to my channel. I really appreciate the support. Have a great one. Cheers, guys.